The first speaker is Tania Burchardt. Tania is Associate Director of the Center for Analysis of Social Exclusion, CASE, and is Professor in the Department of Social Policy at the London School of Economics. Her research interests lie in theories of justice, including the capability approach, measurement of inequality, and applied welfare policy analysis. Tania has held research grants from a number of institutions and funding bodies like the British Academy, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Nuffield Foundation, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission. With Polyvisit, she has led the program of research on capability, equality, and human rights within the CASE Research Center. Her work includes social policy in a cold climate, policies and their consequences since the crisis, with Ruth Lupton, and social justice and public policy, seeking fairness in diverse society, and also the education and employment of disabled young people, frustrated ambition for policy press. Today, Tania Burchardt is talking to a paper entitled Child Poverty in and Out of School. Over to you, Tania.
Thank you very much indeed, Lorella. Thank you, everybody. I'll just share my screen. Okay, I think we're all set. So I'd like to, despite that very generous introduction that Lorella kindly gave, I'd like to start with two disclaimers. The first is that I'm not an education specialist, and the second is that I'm not a philosopher. So quite what I'm doing in an philosophy of education seminar, you might well ask. But where I'm coming from is having thought quite a lot about social policy, including, but not only, education, and thinking quite a bit about inequalities. Second disclaimer is that the data and policy debates that I'm mainly going to reference in my talk relate to England, and I appreciate that many of you have interests in many other countries and contexts. I hope that some of the more fundamental aspects of my arguments, such as they are, might have wider application, but I look forward to talking to you about that perhaps in the discussion later. So we've had news very recently, haven't we, just yesterday, about the UK government's plans for catch-up funding for disadvantaged children who suffered as a result of school closures during the pandemic. Closely followed, hot on the heels, with the resignation of the individual appointed to oversee this programme, who argued that the 1.4 billion announced yesterday was woefully insufficient. He'd argued in his proposals to the government that 15 billion was a more appropriate sum. And indeed, in his statement, he said that the pandemic had affected all pupils, but hit disadvantaged children hardest. And he claimed that a decade's progress to narrow the attainment gap between disadvantaged children and their peers was estimated to have been reversed. Now, I might take issue with that specific claim for reasons that you'll see in a moment, but clearly the overall tenor of his remarks and his position was that it was disadvantaged children who had been particularly hit by the consequences of the pandemic, and that it behoved us to take that seriously and do something about it. So what I'd like to address today is really two questions. The first is, what does this public and policy debate that we've had around the impact of school closures on children from low-income families tell us about how educational inequalities are understood? And secondly, to what extent are current policies well tuned to tackling educational inequalities for children in low-income families? And to give you a preview of the broad outlines of my argument, I'm going to try to show you that I think we usually avoid confronting the impact of child poverty on educational outcomes in normal times, if I can put it that way, that the sticking plasters that we apply within the school system in England basically don't work, and that I want to argue for a paradigm shift to focus policies on child poverty out of school rather than school-based responses to these educational inequalities. So just to remind us, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with this type of statistic, but the gaps in educational outcomes between children in low-income families and others long predate the pandemic, and they were not narrowing, so contrary to Sir Kevin Collins' claim. So this shows for the early years part of education. This is children at the end of what's called the foundation stage, and it's the percent who are judged to achieve a good level of development at the end of that stage, with the grey line showing those the majority of children who are not eligible for free school meals, so broadly equivalent to the non-poor, and the blue line showing those who are eligible for free school meals. And I should say that for sort of reasons of speed, I will use poor, low income, disadvantaged and free school meals as synonyms for the purposes of this talk. But again, I appreciate that in fact there are differences between those concepts and indeed the groups that are identified, the children that are identified by those terms. But so we can see here there was a gap in the data series, in the time series, because they changed the form of the assessment. But we can see there was in fact a narrowing of the gaps between disadvantaged children and others between about 2007 and 2011, 2012. And then there was a further narrowing initially when the new assessment was introduced between 2013 and about 2017. But from then onwards, it was in fact widening again. And this is pre-pandemic, so this just goes up to 2019. At the other end of the educational journey, at level 2, which is sort of good GCSEs levels A star to C, the percentage of young people who'd achieved a qualification at that level by age 19, so by beyond compulsory schooling, the gap there had in fact been widening for the last 5 years between those eligible for free school meals and those not. So this idea that children from low-income backgrounds are disadvantaged in education was really nothing new and should not in any way have taken us by surprise. And in fact, if we compare the gaps, the size of the gaps that we see at the end of the early years foundation stage to those that we see at the other end of education, or the other end of compulsory education, we can see that the gaps between those, the proportional gaps between those who are eligible for free school meals and those who aren't, actually grow. So far from offsetting that difference, that disadvantage, our education system, in fact, if anything, seems to enlarge it through the educational journey. So despite the fact that this was in fact widely known in research and in policy circles, nevertheless, when COVID-19 closed the schools, in terms of public debate, we suddenly discovered that children's home circumstances matter to their education. There was lots of concern about whether households had an internet connection, and if so, whether it was of sufficient quality to support home learning, worries about the availability of IT equipment, whether there was enough room in the house for students to be able to study in peace and quiet, particularly for younger children, but actually also for teenagers. It's essential for them to be able to move around and have space to exercise in order to learn, never mind for their physical health and mental well-being. Questions about whether there was an academically confident parent to guide and support navigate through homeschooling, an IT confident parent to provide all of the support that was needed to access often quite complex platforms that schools rapidly set up to try to deliver home education. And of course, more broadly, concerns about the circumstances that children were living in, and whether, for example, you were in a household where somebody perhaps was a key worker with much greater exposure to the virus, possibly actually falling ill, or even in many cases, of course, too many cases, suffering from bereavement, and also the security of the family income and the way in which anxieties about the standard of living and whether their housing and income was secure impacted on children. So a great deal of hand-wringing about the additional impact of school closure on disadvantaged children. But again, all of this is true when schools are open too. So it matters whether you have an internet connection. It matters whether you've got sufficient space for quiet study. It matters whether you've got a parent who's confident and engaged with schooling to guide and support you. And of course, it matters what else is going on in your household and in your family in terms of your well-being and security. All of those things matter all the time for children's education. It's just that it became considerably more visible during the pandemic. And one just sort of illustration of the way that this seemed to not have been appreciated, this fact of the kind of continuity between the disadvantage that children experience normally in education and the experience during the pandemic, was in my children's school. I was astonished when the school reopened that the laptops that had belatedly been distributed to families who didn't have devices for their children to use for homeschooling were recalled as soon as the school reopened as school property. So the idea that suddenly, because the school was open, clearly there was no further need for the children to have access to IT at home. We also, of course, wrung our hands about the unfairness of assessments this year, this pandemic year. And there was complete muddle, I think, about what fairness means in relation to assessments. So this is just one paragraph that I've highlighted for you here from a Department for Education press release in the early days of the pandemic. This was when they were coming up with the idea of the famous, infamous algorithm. This means, so fair system of assessment means ensuring that GCSE A and AS level students are awarded a grade which fairly reflects the work that they've put in. Ofqual will develop a process that will reflect their performance as fairly as possible and ensure that this is consistently applied for all students. And the exam boards will be asking teachers to submit their judgment about what grade the students would have received if the exams had gone ahead. And it seems to me that in that one short paragraph, we've got at least 4 different underlying concepts about what fairness in assessment might mean. First of all, the idea that it should fairly reflect the work that they've put in. That seems to be indicating that what we think a fair assessment is one that reflects the effort that the student has put in. Secondly, that it reflects their performance as fairly as possible. That sounds like it's a measure of attainment, just the knowledge and skills that you have acquired by whatever means. Thirdly, that it's consistently applied for all students. That looks to be pointing towards a kind of concept of procedural justice, of everybody being treated the same. And fourthly, what they would have got if the exams had gone ahead, which sounds as if a fair assessment would be something around adequately reflecting people's potential rather than their actual level of attainment at a moment in time. In a normal year, I think exams may do a reasonable job on procedural justice. So people are, broadly speaking, treated the same at the point from entering the exam hall through to receiving a grade. And possibly, if we set aside concerns about what actually is being assessed in exams, they may do a reasonable job on attainment, judging whether people have achieved a given level of skills and knowledge. But it's interesting to note that neither of those needed to be affected by the pandemic. There was no reason why the procedure shouldn't be applied in the same way to everybody, nor that the attainment, whatever level people had actually got to, couldn't be assessed. And in fact, pretty much any system that could have been devised, except the one that the government actually came up with, would have achieved procedural justice and could have had some hope of assessing attainment. On the third and fourth possible criteria for what constitutes fair attainment, we should note that exams don't even try in normal circumstances to assess effort. I don't think there's anybody who would seriously claim that a GCSE grade is designed to or intends to reflect the effort that a student has put in. And we know that they do a really bad job in normal circumstances of measuring potential, especially for children from low-income families. And there's, of course, no shortage of research evidence on this connection between bad educational experiences and outcomes and child poverty and family background. So given that all of this was clearly known already, why this hand-wringing about the unfairness of assessments in this particular context? Well, it seems to me that the main reason for this coming to the fore and being debated so vigorously was that for once it wasn't only the children from disadvantaged backgrounds who were being mistreated or unfairly treated according to this fourth measure, the measure of potential, but middle class children as well. And that's why it suddenly became top of the public and policy agenda, not because there was actually anything different about the way in which exams fail to give children an opportunity to show what potential, what academic potential they actually have. So to take a step back and think about what is the evidence on the mechanisms that link worse educational outcomes for children from low-income families. I'm going to just mention 4, although there is, of course, a very big and rich literature on this. So the first idea is that this link between worse educational outcomes and family income derives directly from there being fewer family resources. That's financial resources, material resources, as we were just talking about, like having a quiet place to study, but also the human capital, as it's sometimes called, of both parents and siblings. Second main mechanism is through higher family stress. And again, we've mentioned that was relevant in the pandemic, but is also relevant in every other year as well. The third mechanism is potentially through peer effects. So who it is that's around you and the level of expectations and type of expectations amongst your peers. And that partly operates through the way in which school choice happens in England and de facto selective schooling, even where it's not officially a selective school. And then finally, in terms of school resources, both because schools in serving more disadvantaged communities are doing much more to meet a much wider set of needs than schools in more privileged areas, and because of the parental inputs which some schools are able to draw on, and the better chances of good teacher recruitment and retention in more privileged schools. So for all of these mechanisms, in normal times, it's the pupil premium that is intended to fix all that. That's the policy response. So the pupil premium is a recognition that schools need additional resources to support children who are from low-income families, proxied by eligibility for free school meals. So schools get this additional payment per year, per pupil, and the total programme spending has been at just about £21 billion over the 10 years since it was introduced in 2011. Although before one gets too swept away by that figure, one should note that it replaced other grants, so giving with one hand, taking away with the other, and has been more recently partly offset by changes to the school funding formula, which previously gave greater advantage to schools in disadvantaged areas, and is also in the context of an overall squeeze on school resources per pupil over this period. Nevertheless, the flagship programme, a considerable spend over 10 years. And the stated aim of this programme, as you will probably know, is to improve the attainment of disadvantaged children, and specifically for secondary schools to close what's called the Progress 8 gap, which is the way in which children improve in their attainment by the time they reach their level 2 assessments. Schools have discretion about how to use the fund, so it's allocated by the number of free school meal pupils in the school, but schools can then use that pot in any way they choose. But unfortunately, the evidence we have is that, broadly speaking, it doesn't work. So in some really brilliant research recently published by Sal Riordan and Michael Joplin at Wolverhampton, they've established, I think, beyond any reasonable doubt that the Progress 8 gap is not correlated with most strategies that schools are using for their pupil premium. One of the most popular strategies that schools use is to invest pupil premium in what's known as quality first teaching or continuing professional development. And this is based on their reading of the advice by the Education Endowment Foundation. But schools also use other strategies, and sometimes a mix, including extra staffing, smaller class sizes, pastoral interventions to support well-being, transition arrangements from primary school, cracking down on attendance in different ways, and so on. But unfortunately, there is no association between what strategy a school uses and their ability to close the Progress 8 gap. And indeed, the Progress 8 gap is not closing over time at all. In fact, the most popular strategy, this quality first teaching, is associated in this study with a larger Progress 8 gap. In other words, an intervention that's using pupil premium funding actually results in schools having a wider gap between those eligible for free school meals and those not in their Progress 8 attainment. What seems to be happening is that the investment in better teaching is being lapped up by the pupils who are already advantaged, so boosting their grades at the top, but not in fact reaching the children who are from disadvantaged families, hence resulting in a wider gap. And in this study, which was mixed methods, the interviews with head teachers and teachers showed very clearly the huge commitment that teachers have to this agenda and the enormous efforts that they go to try to implement imaginative, creative strategies in order to help the disadvantaged children in their schools. And they express considerable frustration about the fact that they don't seem to be able to make an impact on this Progress 8 gap, on improving outcomes for disadvantaged children. Schools often try things, find they don't work, return to something that they've done before. In this study, strategies that one school were trying and that they believed were working had been given up for no good by a school elsewhere, and so on. So a great deal of churn in the sorts of strategies that people were using, frustration not being able to shift this indicator. So we might ask, why not? Why, and what else could work? One positive note before I move on would be to say, acknowledge that of course these outcomes and gaps might well have been worse in the absence of pupil premium funding. So we see that this pupil premium funding hasn't succeeded in narrowing the gap. But given that this programme was being implemented at a time when there was an intensification of child poverty, it's not unreasonable to characterise it as a programme that's been swimming against the tide. And it's very plausible, I think, to suggest that outcomes would have got worse. The gap would have got even bigger in the absence of pupil premium. So when I say that child poverty has been intensifying, this is one of the things that I mean, one of the pieces of evidence that I draw on. And what this chart shows is the level of income support, so through either universal credit or so-called legacy benefits for families with children. In the orange line here, this is a couple family with 2 children, compared to the poverty line, with the poverty line set at, as it usually is in official statistics, on 60% of median income, in this case after housing costs. And you can see that the orange line here is diverging from the poverty line. In other words, the level of income that is guaranteed to families who are on benefits, which is families who are eligible for free school meals, the level of income that they've guaranteed is now only 69% of the poverty line. So if you're on benefits as a family, and this is a couple family, it's worse for lone parents, you are guaranteed to be not only poor, but very poor by the fact of the levels of the erosion of the levels of social security payments to families with children. And that stands in sharp contrast to the blue line, which is the line for single pensioners. So single pensioners on pension credit are guaranteed an income that puts them above the poverty line. Part of that is because we've taken £10 billion per year by the end of the period out of social security for children. So this chart shows the cumulative change in social security and tax credit spending on children since 2009-10. And you can see that by the end of the period, we've got down to spending £10 billion per year less on children through the social security system. So what should we do about this problem of the failure of pupil premium to address this gap? The evidence, in contrast to pupil premium, the evidence on what the impact is of giving money to families suggests that it does improve educational outcomes for children. So rather than giving the money to schools, what about allocating that same 21 billion over 10 years to families with children? Well, my colleagues Keris Cooper and Kitty Stewart did a review of evidence on the causal effect of changes in household income on cognitive outcomes for children, and found that the evidence, which is in fact mostly evidence from the US, is that an increase in $1,000 US dollars in annual income for a family improves the cognitive outcomes for children in that family from between 5% and 37%, depending on the study and depending on the measure that's used. And moreover, those effects are larger for lower income households. So that same $1,000 makes more of a difference, as you would expect, at the bottom of the income distribution. So whatever it is that the families are doing with that money, we don't know from these studies what it is they do with that money, but whatever it is, whether it's reducing the family stress, whether it's providing the additional resources, it is feeding through into improvements in educational outcomes for those children. And as Kitty and Keris comment in the conclusion to their article, a boost to income, giving the income directly to the families, is going to have positive effects across a number of different outcomes that we care about, not just educational outcomes. And it's hard to think of another policy that's going to influence as many different outcomes positively at the same time. So here's a summary of what I've tried to say, and then I'll offer one slide of conclusion. So I've tried to suggest that the association between child poverty and worse educational experiences and outcomes for children was foregrounded by the pandemic, but was actually very well known beforehand. The gaps in educational outcomes between children in low-income families and the rest indeed were already growing pre-COVID. So whatever the pandemic has done, it's come on the back of an already deteriorating picture. The concept of fairness implicit in existing assessments is muddled, and it doesn't aim to address the impact of poverty, whatever else it may be trying to do. The government's flagship in-school policy to reduce gaps is not working, despite teachers' considerable efforts. And in part, I think that's because it's dwarfed by the deteriorating financial situation of families on benefits who are the free school meals eligible population. At the same time, we know that increasing household incomes of low-income families is effective in improving educational outcomes. So my conclusion is that we need to develop something like a social determinants approach to education in the same way that scholars concerned about health inequalities have done in relation to health. So the idea that reducing health inequalities can't be achieved through healthcare alone, it's not just about what you do in hospitals or in GP surgeries, that idea has become widely accepted over the last few decades, thanks to people like Michael Marmot and so on. And the focus then has shifted from healthcare and healthcare settings to the social determinants of health, to things like housing, to things like early years provision, employment conditions, diet and exercise, and so on. And I think there's an argument that we need a similar shift in relation to educational inequalities. And rather from continuing to berate schools for failing to fix a problem that's in fact generated outside the school gates, principally in the social security system, I think we should shift our focus instead to tackle educational inequalities to the source of the problem, which is poverty. Thank you.